Imagine a Paris not yet wrapped in the elegance of Haussmann's boulevards, but bristling with tension, fear and ambition. In the 1840s, as revolution simmered and foreign armies loomed, France built a colossal ring of stone and earth around its capital, the Thiers Wall. Stretching over 33 kilometres, studded with 94 bastions and 17 gates, this wall was the last of its kind, a fortress built in an age already turning towards modernity. It shaped the city's growth and became a symbol of control as much as protection. This is more than a story of urban planning. This is the memory of a Paris that once feared both the world outside and the fire within. This is a story of invasion, revolution, war and class divide. Welcome to Metro Stop Podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Blair. In this inter-season episode, I'll take you in a circle around the city and blitz through 24 metro stations, which are all symbolic of the ancient fortification of Paris. The 24 stations I'll be covering today are the stations named Porte, meaning, quite simply, gate. Porte de Choisy, Porte d'Orléans, Porte de la Villette, Porte de la Chapelle, Porte de Vincennes, Porte d'Ivry, etc. Every metro line has at least one gate, and these gates symbolise that you are leaving Paris and you will emerge from a station in the inner city suburbs, le banlieue. Let's journey way back to when Paris was a Roman settlement called Lutetia and stood on the Ile de la Cité on the left bank of the Seine in 52 BC. There was no fortification, as life was quiet and it was a relatively peaceful time. But in the early Middle Ages, there were more and more Viking invasions. Lutetia became a target for its looting opportunities. It was prosperous, and there were rich monasteries where Vikings could plunder gold and valuable relics. The River Seine made it easy for them to reach Lutetia in their longboats and launch surprise attacks. Another tactic was to demand huge ransoms from cities to leave them unharmed. In fact, during the siege of Paris in 845, the Frankish king Charles the Bald paid them 7,000 livres, that's about 2.6 tons of silver, to make them go away. Not all attacks were raids. Some Viking leaders came to lay claim to the land and settle long term. So, walls started to be built in the Ile de la Cité and in the developing settlements on the right bank, in the Marais, or the swamp. These were to stop invaders, but they were eventually destroyed and left very little concrete evidence. What we do know for sure is that somewhere between 1190 and 1215, Philippe Auguste built his wall in response to the threats from the English. When Philip became king in 1180, he inherited a relatively small and fragmented kingdom. Henry II of England not only controlled England, but also vast territories in France, known as the Angevin Empire. That included Normandy, Anjou, Maine and Aquitaine. So imagine this. The King of England was technically a vassal for the French king, but he owned more land in France than the French king himself. Rather than going to all-out war, he played a long game. Through strategic marriages and a chessboard of alliances, King Philip managed to chip away the English sovereignty in France, culminating in a series of military victories and the confiscation of lands. And by the end of his reign, he had dismantled the Angevin Empire, expanded royal control, and established France as a dominant Western European power. In the 14th to 17th centuries, the wall was repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again as the city and her population grew and grew in ever-expanding circles. In 1689, proposals for fortification of the city were declined for being too ambitious. Then came the Wall of the Farmers General in 1784, which was not built for defence, but was a tax gate for anyone with goods entering the city walls. This wall had 60 ornate toll gates, designed by architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux. At these gates, goods were inspected and taxed. Everyday items like wine, food and firewood became expensive to buy inside the wall, and the working class was hit the hardest by the higher prices. It began to shape where people lived and worked, and businesses just outside the wall could sell cheaper goods, attracting customers from inside the wall. People began to smuggle goods past the gate, and in turn it became a symbol for corruption and inequality. It was deeply unpopular. It was dividing the city into taxed and untaxed zones, fueling resentment and anger as revolution was approaching. In 1812, after Napoleon's defeat in Russia, the Sixth Coalition was formed as he retreated. Russia, Austria, Prussia, Portugal, Great Britain, Sweden, Spain, and other nations hostile to France all ganged up and just waltzed in and invaded in 1814's Battle of Paris, and she was left completely humiliated and Napoleon was exiled. It was decided then that Paris needed to be refortified, and the proposal for Thiers Wall came from the then Prime Minister Adolphe Thiers around 1840. Thiers got backing of his cabinet for the scheme while the deputies were away on holiday, but there was fierce opposition from the left, who suspected that the government had ulterior motives, that the proposed walls, and especially the detached forts, were intended to threaten and oppress the Parisians in case of a revolt against the monarchy. The restless and rebellious nature of the Parisians is not a myth, and 19th century Paris was a tinderbox. The city was full of working class neighbourhoods suffering from low wages, high food prices, and poor living conditions, and there were some concerns of uprisings, often sparked by this poverty, political frustration, and a strong sense of injustice. Let's go through some of them. In 1830, there was the July Revolution, where Parisians overthrew King Charles X and replaced him with Louis Philippe. Then, in 1832, there was the June Rebellion, sparked by the death of General Lamarck and worsened by a cholera epidemic, which some thought was caused by the government poisoning the water. Thousands of Republicans and workers built barricades and fought government troops. Pre-Haussmann Paris was full of small, narrow, winding streets, perfect for urban battlegrounds. It was bloody and chaotic, and famously immortalised by Victor Hugo in Les Miserables. Other arguments claimed that by making Paris a fortress with this wall, it would make the city an irresistible target for any invading army. Thiers was forced to resign over an unconnected foreign policy in October, but his successor, Marshal Soult, was determined to go ahead with the plan. Debate began in the legislature in January 1841, and the necessary authorisation for the wall was granted on the 3rd of April. So construction began in 1841, and the wall employed a massive workforce of around 20,000 people. These were mostly paid civilian labourers, not slaves or convicts. The project was state-funded, costing nearly 140 million francs, roughly €1.01 billion today. I worked out this rough exchange considering purchasing power of the currency and inflation. Francs and euro never coexisted, so this is like a generous estimate, but let's just say it was hella expensive. The work was overseen by Guillaume Dode de la Brunerie, managed by the military, but the labour itself was contracted out to civilian workers, masons, diggers, carpenters, amongst other trades. Wages were low and the work was physically brutal, digging moats, hauling stone and building massive ramparts. There were no modern labour protections, no unions, no safety standards and no job security. The 1840s were a time of economic hardship in France, and many workers took this job out of desperation. There was a wave of strikes by journeymen and artisans demanding better pay and conditions, but these were violently repressed by the government. There is no official record of how many people died during construction, but given the scale and the era, there were probably fatalities due to accidents, falls and collapses and tool injuries. Exhaustion and illness may have claimed a few lives, especially in the unsanitary quote-unquote zone around the wall. poor medical care and long hours in harsh conditions. Unfortunately, deaths among the workers weren't well documented at the time, as they were often seen as expendable. The wall was finished in 1846, just in time for the 1848 February Revolution, when Louis Philippe was ousted and the Second Republic was created. The wall held during the Franco-Prussian War and subsequent defeat, which led to the Paris Commune in 1870. It wasn't all war and revolution though. When the Thiers Wall was built around Paris, it really shook things up socially in the outer parts of the city. Before that, the city's official boundary was the aforementioned Ferme Générale Wall, the General Farmers' Wall, which stood until the 1860s. Once the Thiers Wall went up, the grassy area just outside it became a hotspot for wealthy Parisians to stroll and picnic. That sparked a boom in restaurants and dance halls just inside the wall, where, thanks to being outside of the old tax wall, food and drinks could be sold without the usual tariffs. The space between the two walls became known as the Petit Banlieue, or the Little Suburb. It grew fast, especially with working class housing and factories, jumping from 75,000 residents in 1831 to 173,000 by 1856. Some spots stayed rural, like Boutokai in the south, which held onto Paris's last vineyards. Then, in 1853, Georges Eugène Haussmann took charge and kicked off a massive makeover of Paris, starting by clearing out overcrowded slums in the city centre. By 1859, the city's borders were pushed out to Thiers Wall, allowing more development. The wall was refortified in World War I, but by then the protection it was supposed to offer actually hindered the city's growth and created more division. There was the quote-unquote zone, which was meant to remain empty. It was a grassy ditch which quickly turned into a refuge for poor settlers and those people displaced by Haussmann's renovations in central Paris. Over time, it evolved into a sprawling shantytown populated by migrants and minority communities. Homes ranged from sheds to repurposed railway carriages and masonry slums. It was the site of the last outbreak of bubonic plague in France in 1921, where it killed 20 rag pickers. By 1926, the zone housed over 42,000 people. Efforts to clear the slums were slow, hampered by legal disputes with landowners, and only fully completed under the Vichy regime during World War II. The legacy of this marginalised space lives on in the slang term zonard, a pejorative word for a rough young man born in poverty in the Paris zone itself. The demolishing of the wall was completed in 1932, and there are still remnants of it in the 12th, 17th and 14th arrondissement. Our story of ill-conceived urban planner doesn't stop here. There is still a very real physical and psychological wall around Paris, the Boulevard de Périphérique, or simply known as the Peref. The idea for a circular road around Paris dates back to the 1920s, but it wasn't until post-World War II baby boom and the housing crisis that plans gained momentum. In 1954, the city decided to transform the old zone into a modern 8-lane ring road. Work began in 1956 and continued for 17 years. The final segment was inaugurated on April 25th, 1973. It was a means to reduce traffic within the city, but it has impacted the city in so many more ways. Inside this modern wall is central Paris, historically wealthier, more privileged. There is better infrastructure, schools and public services and investment. Outside it is the banlieue, home to working classes or immigrant communities. Housing and rent pricing intramuros skyrocket as there is nowhere for further development. The city cannot extend outwards, nor can it grow upwards. In many parts of the city, buildings are limited to 6 floors. So there is an extraordinarily high demand for property in the City of Lights. This means that many people must leave the inner city and commute daily back into Paris. Which brings me back to the metro stations named Porte, which are on every line and are your sign that you are exiting or entering the city. This so-called last wall of Paris is seen as a class divide for those who cannot afford to live on the Paris side of the Perif. And the areas bordering the highway are densely built up and have social housing these days, what we call HLM. About 100,000 people live within 100 metres of the Périphérique, suffering from noise and air pollution. It is one of Europe's busiest roads and handles 1.5 million cars daily. There is no time of day that there is not a traffic jam somewhere. In short, the Périphérique is more than a road. It's a social division and a symbol of inequality and a real challenge for urban planners who are currently trying to build a more inclusive, accessible and ecological city. It is a ghost of Thiers Wall, which still very much haunts the residents of Paris. This has been Metro Stop Podcast. Thank you to all my sources that helped me research and create this story, all listed in the show notes. Music by Martin Shelkins. Join me in January 2026 for the launch of Season 2, where I will be exploring the stations of the giants of French literature. In the meantime, please follow me on Instagram at Metro Stop Podcast so you don't miss any drops.